We are in another one of these multi-day heat waves where I am in Toronto, but through much of North America, in fact, through much of the world. What do you need to be aware of to protect yourself and to look out for? So there's two things with heat. One is hyperthermia, or what's called heat stroke, which is when your body temperature, core body temperature, gets to 40 degrees and a whole bunch of bad things start happening. The other is dehydration. So both things you are at risk for in this kind of weather. The people most at risk, like for most things, are the very young, so kids, the elderly, pregnant women, and people with chronic conditions. Let's start with kids. So kids have a lower body surface area, so they have less space to sweat from, so less able to dissipate heat, and in fact, sweating is our best mechanism to get rid of that heat. They also may be less aware that they're becoming heated or that they're becoming dehydrated and less able to communicate that. If you have a child that's going to school or going to a summer camp, and obviously you're worried about them overheating or them getting dehydrated, a couple things you can do. Firstly, you want to keep that kid as much as possible indoors in an air-conditioned environment. If they are outdoors, less exercise, because exercise increases that core body temperature, less layers, staying out of the radiant heat, so staying in the shade as opposed to being in the sun. And if they are outdoors, periodically dipping into the pool or going in periodically to cool down in the air conditioning, or for example, to make use of a misting station, various things that schools and summer camps have in place right now. Kids also might not be aware when they're becoming dehydrated, so you want them to have a water bottle, to often hydrate, and to keep an eye on how often they're urinating, they're peeing. And so they should be peeing their usual amount, and their pee shouldn't be too dark, and if it is, that's a sign they're not drinking enough. So that's one way they can self-regulate to make sure they don't get dehydrated. The other group I'll mention is the elderly. So we know that when we had the BC heat dome a few years ago, 98% of people who died indoors. Most were over 70 and most lived alone. So the elderly are a vulnerable population. They again have less of those mechanisms to manage the heat. They can quickly get into hyperthermia. They can get dehydrated. So we want to protect those folks. We want those folks to be accompanied. We want those folks, if they don't have air conditioning, if they live alone, to make their way to a cooling center or a shopping mall or a friend's house, and to have a lifeline, have somebody they can call if they're alone and they're in that situation where they're not able to rehydrate properly or to regulate the temperature in their apartment or where they live. How about pregnant women? So we've had a number of studies, including a study published just last month from the US, showing that when we have these extended heat waves, anything 4 days or longer, there's actually a higher rate of preterm birth. So women tend to go into labor early, and the higher the heat and the longer the heat wave, the higher the risk of that happening. So that's something that women who are pregnant during a heat wave like this need to be aware of. Lastly, it's people with chronic diseases. So when we have these kinds of heat waves, we see more emergency room visits for people with all sorts of chronic diseases. That includes people with kidney disease, diabetes, mental health disease, heart disease, and that's a big one because this heat puts a real strain on our heart. The heart works harder in this kind of heat, and if you have underlying heart disease, there's a higher chance of chest pain. We see more heart attacks, we see more strokes. The last one I want to mention is respiratory disease. This kind of heat puts a real strain on people, particularly with airways disease. So asthma or COPD, the heat can actually trigger that and get into an asthma attack or a COPD flare. And again, we see more emergency room visits for those kinds of problems in these heat waves. If you are in one of those susceptible groups, make a plan in advance. Make a plan with your family, your friends, and with your doctor on what you would do if you get sick and if you get symptoms of either hyperthermia or increasing core body temperature or dehydration. And with hyperthermia, once you hit that 40 degrees, you are going to have confusion, agitation, even seizures. It's too late by the time you're that hot. With dehydration, there will be signs along the way, dry mouth, again, that decreased urination, concentrated urine. Also, people can get muscle cramps, people can get lightheaded, dizzy, nausea. Those are all signs of dehydration. So the heat is here to stay for several more days. We are seeing more and more of these kinds of heat waves with climate change. Be aware and be careful out there.